Welcome back. All right, so I've looked at the playoff picture in the East. Now I want to take a look at the playoff picture in the West. It is interesting that in the East you have six teams that are in the hunt. You could have more that could end up being in the hunt either through dropping down or maybe somebody gets hot. But at any rate, in the West, it's a little more cut and dried. And right now, the Colorado Avalanche sit third in the Central. They're pretty clear of this and yet not at the same time. So they have 67 points. The line is 65. Below the line is 65. So they're only 4 points clear, but they have a 609 points percentage. They've played fewer games than the Calgary Flames, so that helps a little bit. Their 609 points percentage well above Calgary's is that because of that. Their odds of making the playoffs, according to Money Puck, 79.3%. I thought the percentages were a little more important for this video because it does kind of illustrate that in the West, you have three teams that legitimately could end up getting this spot here, although there's two spots open because that's third in the Central. This is your second wild card, and so we'll see how it turns out. But for Colorado, they're trending in the right direction as well. 6-2-2 in their last 10. Landeskog now taken to the ice yesterday, so it's good news for Colorado right now. And it looks like they're gonna get through this really rather rough middle of the season they've had. The interesting thing is this could help them come playoff time, going through all these issues. And then you got a really well rested Landeskog too, right? So at home they're 14-9-4, and away from home they're 17-10-1. So they're good at home, they're good away from home. They're arguably a little bit better on the road than at home by their record. Their upcoming schedule for the rest of February, they're at Winnipeg, then they come home and they play Calgary and Vegas. So the rest of the way through February, these are games that, I mean, for Colorado, they can win at Winnipeg, and if they did, then that definitely could help them in their chase of Winnipeg for second place in the division. And then the home games against Calgary and Vegas, those will be interesting ones to watch because Vegas is excellent on the road. And of course, for Calgary, there should be some desperate hockey here. Although for Calgary's here, their road record is we'll get to it. So we'll see how that turns out. And then in March, 9 home games, 7 away from home for the Colorado Avalanche. In April, 3 home and 5 away, which again could be good for them since their road record ends up being a little better than their home record. 12 of their 27 remaining games are against teams currently above the playoff line. As I mentioned in the video on the East, I'll mention it here as well. Strength of schedule that gets thrown out there a lot at this time of year, I don't think is as important because, not because it's not important at all, but because a lot of the teams that are in the playoffs, as we get towards the end of the season, might be resting players. And for the teams that have already got their seeding decided, do you play your A lineup? And so that's one of those things about strength of schedule that needs to be taken into some consideration. Plus, for the teams at the bottom, they're playing for pride. And so don't rule out victories by teams like Anaheim, Arizona, Vancouver, San Jose, Columbus, because they're playing for pride. Montreal as well. So we'll move on to Edmonton. 57 games played, 68 points. They have a 596 points percentage. Now you'll notice the asterisks. The asterisks are for the teams with the highest points percentage. Unlike in the East, in the West, the teams that are currently above the playoff line all have the best of the points percentages, which really does tend to help, right? They have a 93.2% chance of making the playoffs due to the Oilers. 4-1-5 over their last 10, and much has been made, much hand-wringing over their play recently. I understand that they've had their struggles, and getting those wins has been difficult. But at home, they're 13-11-5. On the road, they're 17-8-3. They're very good on the road. They're mediocre at home. And that is a problem. That is something they're going to need to straighten out if they're going to go anywhere in the playoffs. Now, for the rest of the way, they're at home against Philadelphia first, right? Then they go to Pittsburgh and Columbus. So 2 out of those 3, they should win. I'm saying should because for the reasons I mentioned earlier, those teams towards or at the bottom of the league, whether it's Philadelphia, whether it's Columbus, there's some pride there. Then they're at home against Boston to close out the month of February. Then in March, they have 8 at home, 7 away from home. So they need to get their home record figured out. And then April, they have 2 at home and 4 away from home, which might actually benefit them having the extra games at home or away from home because their record on the road is so much better. 14 of their final 25 games are against playoff teams. So while I definitely have some concerns when it comes to the Oilers, yes, I will agree with fans that there are reasons to be concerned with the Oilers. I don't see them falling beneath Calgary and Nashville. I don't see Nashville or Calgary catching up to them. Nashville currently 10 points back of the Oilers. The Flames 5 points back of the Oilers and having problems of their own. So while Edmonton's not setting the world on fire, I don't see them dropping below the playoff line. Could they drop below Minnesota? Sure. If Minnesota seems to be getting things together, they could. But the Oilers could also end up catching one of the 3 teams ahead of them in that division because the Pacific is really still quite wide open. Now, Minnesota, 56 games played, 65 points for them on the season. They are currently the number 2 wild card. The 580 points percentage is the 3rd best on the board. 71.8% chance of making the playoffs. Interestingly enough, even with the points difference and the fact that Calgary's played one more game, Calgary's given a better odds of making the playoffs than Minnesota through the simulations run by Money Puck, which again are just computer simulations. There's not like some emotional investment in this. It's just here's what the simulations tell us. Minnesota's 5-4-1 in their last 10. So over their last 10, they've gained ground on both Nashville and Calgary. Not a lot. They've gained 1 point, but still, that's one more point that they've gained on teams chasing them. That's important. At home, Minnesota 18-10-3. On the road, 12-11-3. So they're better at home. They like the home cooking more than being on the road. The rest of the schedule is busy for them in the month of February. They're at home against LA. Then they go to Columbus and Toronto. And then they're at home against Columbus and the New York Islanders. So they have 2 games against Columbus by the end of the month. They should be able to win both of those games. Again, they should be desperate for these wins. We should see the kind of desperate hockey that they showed against Nashville in their most recent game where they get that victory. Not only getting that victory in the final minute, but making sure Nashville didn't get a point there, right? So in March, they're at home for 5. They're away from home for 9. And then in April, they're home for 3, and they're away from home for 4. There's definitely some busyness to this schedule. It's not going to be easy. But 11 of 26 games are against playoff teams. So they're generally playing against teams that are below the playoff line the rest of the way. And I would think that would probably favor them. I think Minnesota should pull this out. I think what we see on the board right now of the 3 above the line, the 2 below the line, I think that should balance out. But again, according to the simulations, there's a little bit better odds being given to Calgary getting in than to Minnesota, right? And again, for Colorado, 79.3% is not the kind of percentage you want if you're Colorado right now. You want to get into that 95+% range that teams like Boston, Toronto, Tampa, the top 3 in the Atlantic as examples, New Jersey, Carolina, Eastern teams. But for Calgary, what's interesting is they have 63 points in 57 games. They're below the playoff line. They have a 553 points percentage. So they've just played the one more game than has the Minnesota Wild, but they're 2 points back as well, right? So they don't have a game in hand here. 72.9% chance of making the playoffs. They're 4-4-2 in their last 10. The struggle is real. At home, they're 15-11-2. Away from home, 11-9-9. And that third column there that says 9 away from home, it's hard. Because if they'd won even half of those, you'd be looking at, well, let's just say they had 4 points. You'd be at 67 points. They'd be above Minnesota. They'd be at the same points total as Colorado. They'd be in a much better position, just with 4 extra points. So the overtime losses matter. They do add up. And for the Calgary Flames, if we end up looking back at this season and say, well, Calgary missed the playoffs because they weren't able to play those games after 60 minutes. They weren't able to win regularly enough. That it's not. They won't be the first team to do it. I'm thinking back to Dallas. Dallas is making me nervous this year as well, but they're not on the board because the odds of Dallas missing the playoffs are still really, really low. But yeah, so for Calgary, the rest of the way through February, they're at Arizona, then they're at Vegas, and then they're at Colorado. So there's a 3-game winning streak where one of them in Arizona, that's your big win, right? You should go into Arizona, you should win that. But Arizona's not an easy out, right? Arizona's been showing lately they're not an easy out. They've actually been winning enough games lately, so Calgary's going to have to be careful. And coming off the loss against Philly, they shouldn't have any trouble at all getting up for a game against Arizona. And then Vegas and Colorado are not going to be easy because these teams are still fighting for their lives as well. And then they come home and play Boston. So for Boston, the West Coast swing is coming. They're coming through Vancouver. They're hitting Alberta as well. And we'll see how that goes for them. But for the teams that are going to be hosting Boston, yeah, Boston's not easy. Then in March, Calgary's at home for 8 and away from home for 7. And in April, they're at home for 4. They're away from home for 2. So one thing that does favor them is, after 3 of the next 4 being on the road, to close out the season, they have 12 at home and 9 on the road. So that does favor Calgary. And it is one difference between their schedule and Minnesota's that might explain why they have the better statistical chance right now. They have more home games than does Minnesota, and they have fewer games on the road than do Minnesota. So this could absolutely end up leading to Calgary making the playoffs. Now, 13 of those final 25 games are against playoff teams. So is it an easy schedule for Calgary? No. Is it one that could see them past Minnesota? It could. But they're going to have to get by some of the dysfunction, too. They can't allow for any kind of, dissent might be overstating it, but they can't allow for there to be any issues at all between the coach and the players. They can't allow for there to be any issues at all when it comes to communication around the trade deadline, what the plan is coming out of the trade deadline and all that. You want this team firing in all cylinders. Absolutely. And then Nashville. Nashville, 54 games played, 58 points. So what's interesting with Nashville is they've played fewer games. But with that loss against Minnesota, that hurt. You win in Minnesota, you have 60 points. Minnesota would have 63, and you have 2 games in hand. But by losing that game, you now find yourself 7 points back in Minnesota. You still got 2 games in hand, but you're not in control of your own destiny, right? So 537 points percentage, currently listed at a 9.7% chance of making the playoffs. 5-5 in their last 10. There is the chance. David Poile looks at this team and says, I can't see us getting anything done, and he decides to sell at the deadline. Now, none of the big pieces go on a sell at the deadline. Nashville's not a team that's just going to tear everything down, but it would be interesting to see what would happen if they decided to sell. At home, they're 15-10-3. Away from home, 11-12-3. So their road record has not been kind to them. The rest of the way, they're at home against Vancouver. That game's tonight. And again, that's a winnable game, right? Vancouver, they've had their struggles. Yes, they got the big win over Philly, but it felt like it was a big win because Silovs gets his first NHL win. I'm not saying it was a big win like gets Vancouver close to the playoffs. They are not on this board for a reason. That would not work. There's no way to make an argument for Vancouver in the playoffs. But that's a game Nashville needs to win. And then they go to San Jose and they go to Arizona. So if they win their next 3 games, and they could, that would take them right back into this picture. And this is one of the reasons why I don't think Nashville needs to sell yet. I think you can wait until those 3 games are done. And if you're David Poile, and if they only win, say, 1 out of those 3, then I think you can argue for a sell. If they win those 3, I don't think you can argue that selling necessarily works. Maybe, and I've talked about this before, a soft sell where, if it's an unrestricted free agent, you're not going to keep them. You trade them at the deadline, but you get players back. And you make sure you're not hurting your team's ability to win now. So then they finished the schedule for the month of February against Pittsburgh at home. Remembering Pittsburgh's currently below the playoff line. So that's 4 teams below the playoff line for the Nashville Predators the rest of the way this month. Then in March, they have 6 at home and 10 away from home. So they have to fix their road record. Plus 16 games in the month of March. So, and then they end up with 8 games in April as well. They have 5 at home and 3 away from home. So one thing to keep in mind with Nashville as well is exhaustion and the fact that this schedule is tough. So totally understand the 9.7% chance of them making the playoffs. I'm not going to argue with the computer and the simulations on that. 14 out of their 28 remaining games are against playoff teams. But the fact they have 28 games left, in part because the building flooded, there were 2 games that got delayed into these months, it's going to make it tough for them, because yes, they've got games in hand and they can peg off the points and catch up, but it also means you're going to have more back-to-backs, you're going to have fewer rest days, you're going to have fewer off days, and it does tend to get a little bit tough for them. So we'll see what happens. Do the teams above the playoff line end up making it? Does Calgary end up beating out Minnesota? Can the Oilers turn things around? Does 93.2% seem a little bit high? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, as always, about who makes the playoffs and who doesn't. And again, to me, Colorado being on the board is because they're 4 points clear of that last playoff spot. And I don't consider that to be completely out of danger. But Colorado's been playing well, and I don't see any reason why they don't make the playoffs. But let me know your thoughts. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through, you just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.